How important is it to get a routine for feeding right from birth? Such a common question I get asked, and I think for a lot of new parents, you can't wait until your child and your baby is sleeping through. Well, I've got to say, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as being able to get a complete routine in the first 6 weeks. And I think sometimes some of the advice from different caregivers and midwives and so forth, I think sometimes it's unrealistic to expect that. Remember, your newborn baby has a little stomach. It's the size of almost like an almond, and it's like a little fuel tank. It's a little fuel tank. It can only be filled up with a certain amount, and of course it's growing very quickly. It's growing so quickly, and of course it needs to be filled up again. So, what I would say with feeding is to listen to your baby. If you're breastfeeding, unfortunately, breasts don't come with fuel gauges. You don't know how much you're giving your baby. You've got to listen to your baby. You've got to be able to give your child what they need. And it's such an important lesson right from the time your child's born. Worry what you give your child, not how much. They will tell you how much. If your baby's not getting enough, they're going to wake up, they're going to want to feed, they're going to feed for longer. The important thing about routine feeding is to make sure that your baby gets enough. And as a general rule, there's no hard and fast rule, but in order to establish the feeding, making sure that your baby stimulates your breast to produce enough milk, if you're breastfeeding, at least 8 feeds a day. From the start of the one feed to the start of the next feed, about 3 hours. Of course, they might feed more often. That is down to how big the baby is, how quickly they're growing, and how are they in their sort of first 10 days and second sort of part of that first 6 weeks. So with routine, it's important right from birth to be able to establish a feed. In the first 24 hours, a baby generally has been carbo loaded right from you. And of course, we've cut that source right at birth, and they've got to use up those stores and get hungry and want to feed. So once they are past that first 24 hours, they're going to start feeding. It's important to get them in contact with you. In order to breastfeed, you have to breastfeed. If you're bottle feeding, that is different, because then you can see how much you're giving, and your baby often will feed and sleep and feed and sleep. But with breastfeeding, it's a little bit more tricky. With mothers having cesarean sections, the baby comes at least a couple of weeks early. Your body hasn't been prepared. Your breasts haven't been prepared to produce as much milk. So it's important to get that feeding and have a routine feeding every 3 hours. And it doesn't mean to say that you've got to feed 10 minutes per side or half an hour per side. Breastfeeding is amazing. It's like a Formula One pit stop. It's kind of literally 6 to 8 minutes of efficient breastfeeding like that. But of course, it's different in every baby. And then, of course, over the first month, after your baby has regained their birth weight, that's why we ask parents to come back and chat to us so we can see that the feeding's on track. Once you can see your baby is on track and feeding, you can relax, Then you don't necessarily need to have to feed your baby 8 times in 24 hours. They will then set the pace of how often they need to feed. The most important thing is listen to your child. They will tell you how much they need. They can be overfed. You don't want to overfeed. They're bringing up milk, having reflux and acidic symptoms. The most important thing is make sure that you are adjusting. Have your baby weighed in the first week, at the end of the first week. That's why we ask parents to come back after a week. It really helps gauge exactly how the feeding's going. And then later on with feeding, you don't want to necessarily get the days and nights mixed up. Make sure your baby is put to sleep in a dark environment, so the melatonin levels are adjusted to make your baby feel sleepy and will set up that routine with time. The investment early on is really worth it later on. And then, of course, with the feeding during the day, you don't want your baby feeding or going to sleep and only feeding every 6 hours during the day. They're going to have to wake up and feed at night. So generally, it's as a rule of thumb is to get your baby to feed about every 3 hours during the day. You don't want them to go 5-6 hours because they're going to be up at night. So that's one way of setting a routine. A routine, of course, we all want predictability. We want to be able to set our alarms to things. And of course, as human beings, we don't like surprises. I'm afraid children are not going to do that. They generally will feed when they are hungry, and they're going to let you know when there's an issue. So I think, once a child gets past 6 weeks, they get into more of a routine. They don't need as much sleep. They go longer periods of time. Their tummies get bigger. Little fuel tanks, they can carry more milk, so they can go longer. And that really does help. So I think don't have those unrealistic expectations, particularly in the first 6 weeks.